Emissions data will be important, otherwise investment dollars will not go to those organizations.
Welcome to another week of Global Energy Show's 5x5 series. I'm Rachel Gregory, and joining me today is Jessica Shumlich, CEO and co-founder of Highwood Emissions Management.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
What is Highwood Emissions Management? What is it that you do? And how do you work with organizations to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
We work with industry, government, and innovators around the world to look at what the most effective emissions management strategies are. We have an amazing team that looks at data, analytics, and knowledge to optimize the emissions management solutions.
What are some of the gaps between oil and gas companies within this space? And what are some actions that companies can take if they don't know where to start?
There's a lack of understanding of the value that comes from emissions reductions. So investors and stakeholders are demanding that emissions reduction activities occur, but it's often unclear what the roadmap is and what the value is. And so what we see when we work with companies in this space, in the upstream, midstream, or downstream oil and gas market, we see that first of all, emissions management and emissions reduction need to be mandated from the top level and embedded into the organization, such as public disclosure, target setting for emissions reduction activities, allocating capital budgets, and many other things. After that occurs, then it's time for the oil and gas companies to really understand where their emissions are and what type of projects and initiatives can result in emissions reduction activities. So I think the biggest gap, if you look at it from the ground level on the oil and gas side, it's really understanding what equipment exists, where the emissions are coming from, and then what the most cost-effective ways are to reduce those emissions. Companies might not realize that there are cost-effective ways to reduce emissions, and when stacked up against other projects, especially with the current funding that's available here in Canada, they might actually compete for those capital dollars.
Can you tell us more about the voluntary initiatives available to companies in the oil and gas industry to take credit for responsibly sourced gas?
So Highwood Emissions just recently published a report called Voluntary Emissions Reduction Initiatives for Responsibly Sourced Oil and Gas. And in that report, we broke down the voluntary initiatives into 4 categories. Certifications hold participants to standards, and they have explicit declaration of achievement. Commitments look to the future, and they look at what the goals are, and they look for companies to pledge to those goals. Guidelines might be a set of frameworks, standards, and principles that are followed. And then ESG ratings look at the current state of the organization, usually based on self-reported performance questionnaires. And so these are not exhaustive in themselves, and there's probably overlap, but what we do is we just try to provide a framework for the different initiatives that exist.
What are some key findings from the report?
The biggest finding is that the majority of the initiatives are non-prescriptive, and that allows flexibility for the companies to look at what their greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies are. We also find an opportunity for the administrating organizations to really communicate what the value is of these voluntary initiatives, so that it helps companies really understand why it's important to do voluntary disclosures or ESG reporting or any of the items that we find in the voluntary initiative space.
Why do you think transparent reporting on greenhouse gas emissions is more and more important to companies and their investors?
I think there's a few opportunities here. There's both a monetary opportunity here for companies to potentially take advantage of responsibly sourced gas. We've seen companies take advantage of this by actually getting a premium for their product based on their certification. I think there's also an important aspect of this, which is the license to operate and license to grow. And that includes getting access to capital funding, which will be a benefit of these disclosures. So we've seen organizations such as Climate Action 100, where 2/3 of the investors and 2/3 of the capital that exists in this world are signatories to Climate Action 100, who are saying that voluntary disclosures or public disclosures of emissions data will be important. Otherwise, investment dollars will not go to those organizations. Said bluntly, you must publicly disclose, otherwise you will not get investment. And I think that's a trend that we're starting to see now and will be more and more into the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica. It was so great learning about your organization and the work you're doing to help companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you for taking the time.
It's very nice to meet you. Thank you, Rachel.